If you've been freelancing for more than a year or two, there are two big untapped opportunities that you might be ignoring. One of them is dead leads. And by that, I mean prospects who expressed interest in your services at some point, but just never hired you. The other opportunity is dormant clients, or basically clients with whom you've worked, but you haven't engaged with in a while. These two groups may not award you dream projects. They may not pay you record fees, but they can help you generate cash quickly. They can help you boost your self confidence and buy you some time to find even better client opportunities. Plus, when it comes time to prospecting, this is definitely an easier group to approach because all it takes is sending a simple 9-word email. The 9-word email is one of the most effective email prospecting strategies you'll ever use. You'll be hard-pressed to find another email structure that will generate a higher response rate. It was conceived by marketing legend Dean Jackson, and it's designed to mimic the kind of conversation you would have with someone you know if you ran into them, say, at the grocery store. It touches on something that's relevant to the prospect or client. The message makes it patently clear that this email was written specifically for them. So in other words, it feels like a one-to-one email, very personalized. And it asks a question at the end that just begs for an answer. Now, before we get into actual examples, it's important to understand the psychology behind the 9-word email. And I want you to imagine that you strike up a conversation with someone at a friend's party, someone you just met that evening. And let's just say her name is Jill. And during your conversation, she mentions that she and her husband are thinking about visiting California wine country. You immediately get excited because you've been to wine country half a dozen times over the years. So you give Jill a list of recommended wineries, some quaint inns and bed and breakfasts to consider, and excellent restaurants to visit. Jill is ecstatic to talk with someone who knows this much about the area. She thanks you numerous times for the tips and the recommendations. And then let's just say that a few weeks later, you run into Jill at the grocery store. And after greeting her, you ask her a very simple question. Hey, are you still thinking about going to wine country this summer? Or maybe, hey, did you end up booking that trip to California wine country? Doesn't that sound like a natural question to ask? You're bringing up something relevant from your conversation at the party a few weeks back. So it just feels like a sincere way to start a new conversation. All right, let's take another example. This one's a little bit out there, so bear with me because the lesson is still very, very important. And I think if you just kind of just suspend disbelief for a minute, you'll see where I'm going with this. Let's say that you are working at the men's department at Nordstrom, and a customer comes in, and let's call him Mr. Smith, looking for a brown sweater. You help him select a few options. He tries some of them on in the dressing room and then sets two of the sweaters aside by the register. And he tells you, look, I'm not sure which ones I want. Let me just look around a bit more and come back. And you reply with, of course, take your time, Mr. Smith. So you turn to help another customer, and let's just say that an hour later, you realize that Mr. Smith never came back, and the sweaters he tried on are still sitting by the cash register. Later that afternoon, during your lunch break, you run into Mr. Smith at the food court. And what would be kind of, again, I know this is odd, but what would be maybe a realistic dialogue? How would that conversation go if you were to strike up a conversation with him? Maybe something along the lines of, hey, Mr. Smith, great to run into you here. Now, if you were to ask him a question after that greeting, what would that question be? Maybe something along the lines of, hey, do you still want those sweaters? Again, I know this is a silly hypothetical example, but I think you can see how such a scenario might play out in real life. Essentially, here's what happened in both of these hypothetical situations. First, you had a conversation with someone. Next, you discussed X, whatever X might be, but nothing came from that. Next, you ran into them later and you asked them about X. All right, so what does this have to do with prospecting for clients? Well, think about how you might typically prospect online. Maybe you send out a monthly newsletter that includes a plug about one of your services. Or maybe you send Emails of introduction explaining what you do and whom you serve, or maybe you post a blurb about what you do on one of your social networks, hoping to attract some prospects who might need these services. In all these cases, you're sending a broadcast, a one-to-many email, if you will. By that, I mean one message to many people. And we all know how these methods work. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. You throw enough spaghetti and a few noodles might stick. Maybe. But what if you took a different approach? What if instead of taking a one-to-many approach every single time, you instead tried to start a conversation with one prospect at a time? That's where the 9-word email comes in. The 9-word email is one of the most elegant conversation starters you could ever use. And that's what it is. It's a conversation starter. It's not the full story. It's just the trigger. Let me first give you an example, and then we'll break down the components. For this one, the subject line reads, white papers. Hi, Joan. Are you still thinking about hiring an outside white paper writer this year? Ed. That's it. That's it. Why does this email work so well? First, let me point out the obvious. If you were counting, you'll notice that this particular script is longer than 9 words. And that's perfectly fine because the 9-word email is really more of a concept than a literal formula. The idea behind 9 words is really just to keep your email extremely short. And in many cases, it's going to feel uncomfortably short for you. But it's not just about the brevity. What makes a 9-word email incredibly effective is that when done right, it follows Dean Jackson's SPEAR formula. SPEAR stands for short, personal, and expecting a reply. The personalization in the example above that I just gave you is obvious when you understand the context. In that example, Joan had expressed interest in hiring a writer for some white paper work. She and I had some email dialogue about it 3 months ago. We also got on the phone to discuss her project, but then she disappeared. I followed up a few times after that, but never heard back. Bottom line is she's now, for my purposes, what I would call a dead lead, right? I have no idea what's going on. She's just not responsive. But now that a few months have passed, I'm touching base again. And rather than going into a long and drawn out follow-up email, which is what I might typically do, I'm getting right to the point. And I'm pointing out the thing about which she had expressed interest. In other words, the sweaters are still sitting by the cash register, to go back to my Nordstrom example. In fact, in my mind, I'm pretending that I just ran into her at the food court. I'm imagining what that conversation might look like in real life. Maybe something like this, if you can, again, suspend disbelief for just a minute. Hey, I know you, Joan, right? And she might respond, yes, hi, what a surprise to run into you here, Ed. How are you? And I might reply with, great, business is good. I just wrapped up a great year. How about you? What's going on? Oh, crazy as always. There's just never enough hours in the day. You know how it is. Oh, I hear you. Hey, that reminds me. Are you still thinking about hiring an outside white paper writer this year? Now, think about that conversation. Doesn't that sound like a very normal and natural dialogue, considering what's happened over the past few months and the nature of our relationship and previous conversations? And yes, I realize you're probably not going to run into a prospect at the food court or at the grocery store, especially if you live in LA and Joan lives in New York. But just pretend for a second that this actually happened. Wouldn't this flow of a conversation feel natural? It pretty much mirrors the conversation that I would have if I ran into someone I haven't talked to in a while. Now, think about the last question I asked Joan, hey, are you still thinking about hiring an outside white paper writer this year? Can you imagine a scenario where Joan would abruptly just walk away without answering the question? No, that would be weird. If we were standing in front of each other, I can pretty much guarantee that she'll answer the question because that question just begs to be answered. I mean, think about just the dynamics of that situation. That's the expecting a reply part of the SPEAR formula. So let's go back to that previous email script. Subject line, white papers. Hi, Joan. Are you still thinking about hiring an outside white paper writer this year? Ed. Note the following in that email script. First, there's no fluff. There are no wasted words. I'm getting right to the point. Also, I'm not warming up the prospect with small talk, which is what everyone does. Hey, hope you're having a great summer so far. How are the kids? Whatever, right? Subconsciously, when you or get right to the point, it shows the prospect that I respect their time. Also, sometimes you have to add some context to the prospect so the prospect will recognize you, but it's best to do that later as a PS, for example, or maybe by including a previous email thread in your email. And that way there's some context there and she can connect the dots if she's not really sure who this is or if she really doesn't understand what you're talking about. Also, notice that I'm not dancing around the issue. I'm not using meaningless follow-up. Hey, I'd be happy to discuss your needs or let me know type of language. For instance, like let me know if there's anything I can do to help you with any writing projects. You just get rid of all that. That's a necessary filler. I don't need this email to do all the work. That's the other important point. I'm not trying to land a project. As I mentioned earlier, I'm simply trying to rekindle the conversation. The selling happens later, but I need to restart that dialogue first. Finally, note that the subject line is very direct. That's the opposite of what we'd normally use in a marketing broadcast where we're trying to arouse curiosity with a subject line. There's a time and a place for that. Absolutely. I do it all the time. But for a 9-word email, you want to be very, very direct. You don't want to give the impression of a bait and switch. You don't want to use a curiosity subject line. You want to use a very simple, plain subject line. Now, if you don't have a specific project you can point to as a follow-up, that's fine. There are many ways you can rekindle a conversation with a dead lead or a dormant client through a 9-word email. Here are just some ideas. You can bring an idea to the table, maybe a marketing approach or idea you used effectively with another client, or a creative way to repurpose or reuse content they may not have considered. For instance, have you considered repurposing some of your blog content into podcasts? Something else you could do is you can announce a new service you're now offering and ask if they've ever considered doing something along these lines. Here's an example. Do you publish ebooks as part of your lead generation efforts? You can also ask them about something they were doing last time you had contact with them. How did your Harmonics product launch go? You could tell them you're already booking for next month and are curious if they're still thinking about writing that, whatever it may have been that they had talked to you about writing. I'm scheduling projects into October. Wanted to see if you're still thinking about doing that website copy refresh. Or you could turn that into a question, right? Are you still thinking about doing that website copy refresh? You could reach out to a new contact in the organization. For instance, I worked with Dormant last year on a series of articles and case studies. Are you still publishing customer case studies? So as you can probably see by now, there's great hidden potential in your list of dead leads and dormant clients. And the possibilities with these 9-word emails are endless. But don't let their simplicity fool you. These emails are very powerful, but they require some thought before sending. So take the time to think through each prospect and each client before drafting your script. Think through your history with each specific prospect or dormant client and come up with a message that feels natural and just begs for a reply. Finally, remember these short emails are conversation starters. They're very reliable conversation starters. Most of them will not, however, generate immediate work on their own, but that's okay. I'd rather have a system for sparking numerous conversations than an unreliable system for generating work quickly, because I know that every great client relationship starts out as a simple conversation. This has been Ed Gandia with High Income Business Writing. To get other tips and strategies for earning more in less time, doing work you love for better clients, visit b2blauncher.com.